Okay, so good evening, everyone. I'm Melissa Young, and on behalf of the School of English at the University of Nottingham, Malaysia, I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to all of you. Thank you for joining us this evening. We are thrilled to host this research talk by Dr. Olaoluwa Duro-Bello. Ola is a doctoral alumnus with the School of English. I remember the many conversations that Ola and I had about his PhD thesis when he was at UNM, and it was very exciting to see his thesis come together. So it's wonderful that he's able to share his completed study with us today. As a researcher, Ola's interest lies in the analysis of text, talk, and social situations that are characterized by inequality, fraud, power abuse, misrepresentation, and discrimination. Since completing his PhD, he has returned to his home country and currently teaches at the Federal University Lokoja in Nigeria. Before we begin, just a few digital housekeeping points. This event is being recorded and will be uploaded to the school's Facebook page and YouTube channel, so you can rewatch this later if you like. Your microphones are currently muted. However, after the talk, there will be a Q&A session during which you are free to ask questions via the chat box or just raise your digital hand and unmute your microphone. And now I'm delighted to hand over this event to Ola.
Thank you very much, Melissa. Thank you for the warm welcome. Thank you for the warm introduction. And as you mentioned, we've had countless conversations about an aspect of the topic which I will be speaking on today. Please, if at any point in time you can't hear me or if I start speaking too fast, just let me know with the digital hand sign so that I would adjust. So I am really delighted to be in everyone's midst. Although this is virtual, it pleases me that I have the opportunity to once again speak to friends and those who have mentored me on my academic journey as a doctoral candidate while I was at UNM. As Melissa mentioned, I have returned to my home country, Nigeria, and the context of my study throughout my doctoral period was Nigerian political discourse. So chiefly, everything I analyzed throughout my doctoral study was drawn from Nigeria. And for those who would require just a slight bit of context, Nigeria is the most populous African country. I know Nohan is in the audience. We have that one on Egypt. Okay. So as you would all agree, there's a range of discourses that would be worthy of analysis. But one that I found personally fascinating was the discourse of politics. Now, my interest in politics lies in understanding how the resources of language are deployed by politicians to depict different phenomena. And I chose the term personally because long before I began my PhD journey, I had a personal experience with the representation of a phenomenon or the representation of an event through the prism of politicians. And as in quotes now, a victim of that event, I wasn't necessarily satisfied, or I was displeased at the kind of representation I was seeing based on the kind of experience I went through. And so this got me at that very early stage wondering about representation in general, and then more specifically, representation when it comes to politics in Nigeria. Hence the title for my talk, The Politics of Representation in Nigerian Political Discourse. I just felt it would be great for us to know where I was coming from when I started this journey and how this entire talk will go. So in terms of signposting for the talk itself, I'll walk you through the outline for today's talk. Briefly, I'll walk through my introduction, and then I'll talk about a background to the study. Firstly, I'll be describing the context and just what kind of background, which I've just alluded to now, And then I would define just a few key terms or how they are used. I'll leave this short, I'll leave this brief, because I only want to deal with representation as a concept and then bring us all back into language. So how is language a medium for representation? I'd try to keep it as straight to the point as possible to just ensure that we have enough time for other aspects of the talk. I'd walk us through the analytical framework that I applied for my doctoral thesis, and then we'll take a look at the findings and discussions. So as quite a number of you have possibly written a long essay or a thesis or a dissertation, you would know that cramming everything into a talk of, say, 30 to 40 minutes would really put in some work. So I'll give some of the ones I considered key, and the ones worthy of discussions and negotiations is what I'll talk about here. And after that, I'll just give closing comments, and then, like Melissa said, the floor will be open for questions. So, background to the study. In many ways, politics. Okay. So, in many ways, the politics of representation is a slippery concept. It's not straightforward to say representation is this, representation has a fixed meaning. No, so we can't pin it down or attach it to a specific meaning. So one good starting point would be to consider what representation is and how I conceived it or how I applied it throughout the phase of my doctoral study. So that slippery slope is what we want to go on now. And that would have to do with what representation is, and I'll discuss this. So I've adapted the definition from Wendin, 2005, and it described representation as language used in text or talk to assign meanings to groups and their social practices, to events, and to social and ecological conditions and objects in discourse analysis. Yes, this is a bit of a mouthful, but what I was keen on, and what I'll be keen on also discussing today, would be the notion of assigning meanings. Representation has to do with assigning meanings. Now, this meanings makes representation a process and not a product. So we don't see the end of a representation as that product. We're looking at the entire process in which the meanings are enacted. And that's why, as an analyst, you can then deconstruct those meanings, because you're dealing with a meaning-making process. The process in which phenomenon A is ascribed meaning B, or phenomenon A is ascribed meaning A, B, or C. That entire process is what we look at as representation. And these meanings can be ascribed to individual subjects, they can be ascribed to groups, as well as social practices and a number of other features that the definition has captured. Now, the next thing in the definition that I would want to touch on is the fact that it has to do with language use. So language is a key component. It's the principal idea in representation. We represent using language. And so to take this a notch further, we can say language is central to the process of representation. Language is key to the process of representation. So while I know I've premised this study as a linguistic study, it already hints that just about everything that I would do or everything I would talk about would have to do with how language is used or how language is deployed. So back to that definition, language is central to the process of representation. It is the medium through which we assign meanings to our actions or meanings to the actions of others. And when we also want to remove those meanings, we also use language. So it just shows how representation is actually active. It's not something that is static. It's not something that is fixed. It is something that is active, and just as I would indicate now, it's ever changing. So we may index our expressions, we may have these social relations. This is where I stop. Language indexes, expresses, and constitutes social relations, while at the same time challenging social relations. So language is both constitutive and is constant. Language is both constitutive and constitutes itself. So next slide is that representation is a site for contestation. So while we represent, there's always a lot of contestation taking place. What this means is one representation will contest the same ideas with another representation of the same phenomenon. And we can depict this in three ways. The subject in itself can be contested with a representation of the subject, as well as the self-representation. To explain this, it means if I was representing a particular subject or a particular phenomenon, my representation could potentially, or it's in some cases expected, to have contestations with a self-representation by that same subject. So if I was representing Nigerian politicians and another individual, of course it does seem basic as those saying, yes, because we see things differently, we would represent differently, but it is necessary to point out that it's just a key feature of representation that contestations will exist. These contestations may occur from the subject itself, it may occur from the representations of that subject from another analyst, or it may occur from self-representation by the subject or the phenomenon itself. The big question is, after considering what representation is, how it appears, the question is, why should we care? Why is it important to actually look at representation? What is political about representation that would necessitate a study? What would we stand to achieve? How would it be significant if we indeed carried out a study on representation? What do we stand to get out of it? And for me, there's just one answer that guided me through this process. And that answer is that representation is powerful. What we can achieve through representation, or what representation can achieve in the hands of politicians, is very powerful. And we can consider this in 4 different steps. The first is that one of the crucial tasks for CDA is to account for the relations between discourse and social power. So in discourse, you have manifestations of social power. When you have a discursive representation of a phenomenon, you see the manifestation of that phenomenon as being powerful. One example I could cite to do this would be current energy crisis. The representation of energy crisis per se, depending on who is speaking about it, can determine whether who the person representing it is speaking from a position of abundance or a position of lack. A second reason why representation is powerful is because it can be deployed as a tool for social control. So depending on how one group may represent other groups, may determine how that group can exercise its control over those other groups. We can exercise control both willingly and directly. We can do this, we can exercise control in very subtle and very implicit manners. We can limit the freedom or the action of other people through the exercise of control. And how this is done is not done, it can be done forcefully, but not necessarily. The representation of a group can determine whether that group is under subjugation or not. We can influence people's knowledge, we can influence people's attitudes, we can influence ideologies through representation. And so this tells you that whether representation is put as the fore of a study, once you are able to see how much power it has and how much power and control it can exercise, it tells you how important it is to put it under the prism of analysis. Whenever I touch this, it doesn't move. Okay. Yep. So, thirdly, representation is a site for contestations, as I had mentioned earlier. This would mean that no meaning is fixed. What we represent now, or the social representations we see now, 10 years from now, could change for the same phenomenon. So it can be deemed as a manifestation of ideology when discourses are constructed as the only acceptable means of viewing the world. So if, for example, I view the world in a particular manner, or a group views the world in a particular manner and represents the world in that manner, if that representation is not subjected to any contestation, if that representation is not contested, is not subjected to any criticism, is not subjected to any analysis, it has the means of actually going unnoticed and influencing views beyond any kind of reach, and that therein would lie the manifestation of a particular kind of ideology, and then analysis would therefore help us reveal this. I'll cite an example of this with the fourth one, when we say representation is not enduring or permanent, and I'll draw this from what I've tagged the curious case of Sheikh Gumi. This is one individual who has become rife in Nigerian political discourse in the last 10 years. But the representation of this individual, both in the media as well as in politics, has not always remained the same. And there's a stark contrast between how his representation was for, before 2009, Sheikh Gumi was considered a deserter. He used to be in the Nigerian army. He ran campaigns and just went blank. But throughout that period, he was considered to be a deserter. By 2015, with the change in government, he is considered in many circles, or represented in many circles, as a savior. Savior in the context of how he has interacted with bandits, and as we will come to see in the study that I will soon be talking about, his interrelations with Boko Haram. On to the analytical framework for the study. So basically, with the few slides beforehand, I would have hoped that I would have established what representation is and how representation manifests in discourse, or why I have chosen, or I had chosen to look at representation. And so the keynote for me there was that it was powerful, or that it is powerful. It's a powerful tool. It can be used to enact social relations. It can be used to embed ideology. And so I required an analytical framework to understudy representations. So I had already established that the discourse data would be political discourse, but then I needed to look at how representation was occurring in political discourse, and then examine the kinds of power that representation manifested in this niche political discourse. And this led me to Theo van Leeuwen's social semantic inventory for representing social actors. So it's an inventory that has its different features premised upon the notion that discourse is a social practice. And in each social practice, we can have inclusions, we can have exclusions, and within each inclusion, we can have ways in which each of those social actors are either foregrounded, backgrounded. I'll show a rundown of the full inventory. In those social actors, we would see how they participate as participants. We would see how they enact processes. We would see processes, participants who are affected, participants who are beneficiaries of certain processes. We would see performance modes. We would see times and settings. The second reason for going to this framework was because I found it to be particularly compatible with Halliday's systemic functional grammar. In a nutshell, that looks at how representation can show who in this sense would be a participant, is doing what will be the process, what to whom will be yet another participant, and then under a certain circumstance will be the setting in which that event took place. So that compatibility, that synergy between the social semantic inventory and a theory of grammar is what led me to apply to this data set. So just to reiterate, the social semantic inventory looks at the data, looks at text, and then using certain categories, parses these participants into the roles that they feature in that discourse. And then with the theory of grammar, we're able to see things like transitivity choices, thematization, as well as interpersonal or modal relations between the participants. So in essence, in a nutshell, these two theories became compatible and they were tailored to suit the data set for the study. So this is just an overview of what the inventory looks like. At the far left, we have the inclusion and the exclusion. So those are the broad categories that it looks at. For exclusion, it will just talk about how each social actor in that data set is either completely excluded or just de-emphasized. So when it is completely excluded, we have a case of suppression. The social actor is suppressed in that data set. When we have a bit of de-emphasis, we have a case of backgrounding. So the social actor may be represented, but just not as, would I say, forceful as possible. It's just not right there in the face of the reader or the audience. It's in some sense de-emphasized, taken to the back. And then when we move to the next broad category, which is the inclusion, it looks at, okay, when the social actors are represented, how are they represented? In what roles are they represented? Are they in active roles? Are they in passive roles? Are they in beneficial roles? And so the entire network is what can then be applied to data, whether this data is in text or in text or in talk, and has even been applied to multimodal data, in the sense that pictures can also be analyzed using the framework. And just as I mentioned in the previous slide, this was complemented with Halliday's meta functions. All 6 have just been captured here in this image. So the material, the behavioral, the mental, verbal, relational, and existential. What this means is that for each of the social actors in the data set, each clause in that data set was analyzed to see how they fit into these 3 meta functions, where we look at how the social actor acts upon other physical entities within the discourse space. So those would be material processes. And then we looked at how there were mental relations or mental depictions or representations of the mental states of these social actors. And then thirdly, or broadly speaking, the plane of relation, how one entity relates to, or how one phenomenon relates to the other, and that's we come across in relational processes. Just to give a brief about the data in question, the data comprise 28 political speeches delivered by Nigerian's president between 2010 and 2015. So all these speeches were collected. They constitute a niche corpus of Nigerian political discourse. The speeches were written to be read, so the president had these speeches written down, and then he would deliver them, and all these speeches were in English. And all of the data that was collected were corroborated as official transcript. What this means is I initially collected the speeches from the Nigerian State House as the official transcript, but just to ensure that I was able to confirm that this was necessarily the same kind of speech across board, I corroborated this with 2 other sources. So that's the State House website was the main source, and then the Nigerian state media was able to provide a corroboration for it as of an official transcript. So the question is, in this study, the representation of who or the representation of what? In one word, it's the representation of social actors. So we can look at representation from those who act. We can look at representation from the events or the activities acted upon. We can look at representation in the settings that they occurred. I was particularly looking at the key social actors in this phase. So like I said, the speeches were collected, the speeches spanned between 2010 and 2015, and they span within this period because Nigeria at the time was facing its deadliest crisis with the group known as Boko Haram. So I was interested in seeing how the president represented them, that's this group, this group, as well as how he represented other key social actors during that period. And broadly, this would be categorized into 4. First of all, we have Boko Haram, far left, and then the representation of the Nigerian security forces, which will be the direct antagonist of Boko Haram from the government or the president's point of view. And then we have the third group that the data set was able to show would be the victims of Boko Haram, and then the fourth would be the representations of the government as well as the president himself. So this was separate to show the case of self-representation. In other cases, the president was representing other social actors, but in this aspect of the analysis, I was looking at the self-representation of the president himself and the representation of the government which he was leading. So this would be the 4 broad categories. I wouldn't touch on all. I would just touch on Boko Haram in itself, and then one of the key findings with the notion of identity. So ideology was very key for me when I carried out this study. It happened to be the first thing I thought I was doing. And I say I thought because at the time I thought I was just going to read it. I was going to read the speeches, and then I'll be able to apply some level of interpretation and say, hey, yes, there you go, that's one ideology. Oh yeah, there you go, that's another ideology. But this was entirely different. It almost seemed like I had started off thinking I knew what ideology is, and sometimes I even tell myself maybe I don't even know what ideology is at this point. But that was what I sought to do, that if representations are done in a particular manner, can we argue that it would therefore depict the ideology of the speaker, or the ideology that the speaker wants to foreground about the groups being represented? That was what was the guiding principle for me to look at ideology. And so I came to the realization at the end of the study that there was a weaving of enemification in the discourse. And so the discourse, the speeches from the first to the 28th speech had weaved into it this notion that Boko Haram was an enemy and a standout aggressor. And I would show in using 3 examples how this was the case. First would be with the nomination conventions that were in the speech, the transitivity patterns, and then the thematization patterns. So for nomination conventions, this is just, rather than that mouthful, what were the groups called? So what were each of the social actors called? So I had this analysis of what each of the social actors is called, whether we're looking at the proper nouns that are used to refer to them, whether you're looking at pronominalizations. But here I just want to focus on the common thread that ran through the notion of the group being terrorists, the notion that they were enemies, and the notion that they were haters of peace. Now, this thread that ran through was a nomination convention that I would say, I don't want to use the term unmistakable, but what I would say is through it, the predominant use was to depict them in what they were called as terrorists. And when you name an individual, now, whether this is Boko Haram or not, when you name any social actor a terrorist, it therefore determines the kind of action you can do to a terrorist. If you name the social actor something else, that would invariably also determine the kind of action you can carry out to that social actor. And the next thing I wanted to look at was whether these nomination strategies existed only in Nigerian political discourse, or I could find it elsewhere. And indeed, it could be found in other studies, and in three ways. Whenever these type of non-state actors were nominated, when they were named, I found these three broad categories. Of course, there are a number of others that could that do exist, but these are three that I want to highlight. The notion of evilification, I don't know what this is today. So how they are equated, or you see a contrast between good and evil. So they are associated, these type of non-state actors are associated with the realm of evil. Pierce in his looked at it as a demonization of the other. And Jackson looked at these type of non-state actors and their representation under the notion of Islamophobia. Interestingly, the data I studied, the Nigerian political discourse, didn't have any inclination towards that of Islamophobia. So they weren't associated with any religion in question in its entirety, let alone Islam. But I found that at least elsewhere, it showed that this sort of representation could take place and could be associated with religious ties. But what was central, though, was the notion of the group being an enemy, and enemies will do what? Enemies will do evil things. So in terms of transitivity, I wouldn't be showing the transitivity parsing. Rather, I would be presenting what the concordance are, because that would give a much more robust picture in play. So what this shows is, in blue, we have the representation, though it's pronominal, we know from this that it is referring to Boko Haram and what they have done. So the transitivity line would show them in the role of actor. It would show their processes as being material. Material processes in this instance would be processes that have some coloration of a physical change occurring in the object that is being acted upon. What this means is a material process will be something like he broke the cup. So the cup in this sense is a physical entity of some sort, and this whole notion of breaking it would entail some physical application of force, and so that shows a material sense. That's a material sense, at least how Halliday connotes it. So in these concordance lines, we see material actions, but not just material actions for what they are, but transitive material actions. In this sense, it refers to actions that actually have a reference, has a destination. There's a point of impact, not just an action that takes place, not just a material action that takes place without a point of impact, in which we'll be dealing with what Halliday calls a scope. But in this case, it deals with material action that has a point of impact. There's another social actor, or there's another entity affected by the actions of that social actor. And in this instance, we're saying that the representation of Boko Haram is seen to affect other entities. So bearing this in mind with enemification, they are the kind of enemies that would attack government buildings, destroy countless schools, destroy the Nigerian flag, kill men and women. And you can go down the list to see how this representation, both in the nomination as well as in the representation of the transitivity choices, tilt towards that. Of course, in the grand scheme of things, the ideology in play here is that of negative other representation as opposed to positive self-representation of our in-groups, and that's what that's what I reach at the end of the study as my conclusion. So just before I move, the second notion that I examine, and at least I report about in my findings, is that it's not just in what they have done, but it's also in representing who they have done it to, who this social group, who these social actors, that's Boko Haram, have done these actions to. So we would see mostly vulnerable and unarmed social actors, sometimes prefaced with the word innocent, to show that these actions have been unprovoked. We would see choices that show this sense of unison. So we're drawn from which are drawn from the discourse field of the family. You hear, as we can see here, our mothers, our sisters, our brothers, to show that we are one unit, but we have these elements that have continually attacked this one unit. Now to move on to yet another representation, which for the purpose of this talk I'm considering key, is the representation of Nigerians and the notion of identity, and how identity comes into play in the representation of these social actors in discourse. Now, identity wasn't something I set out to look out for, but it came out as a byproduct of the study, where I found that the representation in itself was there, but it just seemed to now, it was just underneath it that I was seeing that the president's discourse appeared to be creating a kind of national identity, and then recurrent, and having this recurrent in the discourse space, in the sense that having Nigerians continue to listen to this continues to show that that is the kind of dissemination that he was going for. So the national identity that was that I found in the data set happened to be relational, and relational in the sense that national identity was constructed in direct opposition to whatever Boko Haram's identity is. So it was said to, it would be said to depict that Nigerian, true Nigerians are different from Boko Haram. Secondly, on the notion of national identity, I found it interesting that class struggle was de-emphasized. So it didn't matter whether the president was going to speak about those who are in the lower class or the upper class or in the middle class. Everyone was lumped together to say this is a struggle that affects everyone. And nationalism, and especially as it relates to how Nigeria got its independence and how we are all one and how the country is one towards this one enemy, appeared to be what received more attention, regardless of where Nigerians are. So it sort of said, we may be different and it doesn't matter in this case, but what matters is nationalism, because Boko Haram, at least in the discourse, was shown to be that social actor that was thoroughly against the whole national idea, or this whole idea of nationhood for the country. Thirdly, and well, in the current climate and in the current way that things are, just to make a slight reference to what's going on in Ukraine and in Russia, foreign intervention was wholesomely welcomed. That whatever we could do and whoever could help should help to ensure that Nigerians' national sovereignty remained. And so there were different appeals to external forces in terms of for what would otherwise in another representation could be represented as actually an internal issue. But this notion was largely welcomed for any form of foreign intervention. Most appeals went to the UK, to France to say, with what is going on in the country, what kinds of interventions that could come in play. And finally, we looked at, I found that this whole notion of the true compatriots of Nigeria would do more. There was this vague sense in which Nigerians were represented, but what they were meant to do was vaguely put, and that's why I put it in quotes. The whole notion that there's this idea that more needs to be done to support the security forces. I found this representation to actually be a little bit subversive, and subversive for me in the sense that the president, the government, the security forces are actually, by the Constitution, mandated to provide security, but the inversion showed that there was some kind of support that the government, or at least the president in his representation, was expecting of what you would say ordinary Nigerians to be able to rid the country of Boko Haram. In terms of these are the broad two categories that I wanted to speak about today. And so I will touch on the closing comments that I have. It's difficult to truly know the intent of a political speech, but I think it's not complete. One conclusion that is drawn from the end of the study is that, at least in the means that Nigerian politicians represented, their speeches advance national identity that follows a particular cause. So depending on the cause that the politician wants to advocate, he would be able to use that political discourse as a vehicle to advance it. And then, as the examples I had just cited had shown, political discourse contributes to advancing to discursive formations of in-groups and out-groups that are relational and dialogic in nature. What this means is, I found opposing and polarized representations of Nigerians, the government, the security forces, the president, in opposition to Boko Haram's representation. So this for me also lends true to what I was saying at the start about representations having contestations, that this shows some level of conflict or some level of contest in the kind of representation that the president had chosen. With that being said, I would like to thank you all for listening, and I would welcome any questions.
Thanks so much, Ola. So we're opening the floor now to all of you. You can ask questions via the chat, or you can just unmute yourself and ask Ola any questions that you have. Ola, I think you can stop sharing your screen, then you'll be able to see everything.
I'm trying to figure out how to do that now.
Okay.
Got it. I get it. Oh, yes, I can see the...
So I think I can see someone typing in the chat box. So you may have a question coming in.
Okay, that was Chuma.
Yeah, I think Norhan is typing her question.
Okay. Norhan, go easy on me. I haven't had breakfast. It's actually 10 a.m. here.
Yeah, it's early. Would you like to just unmute yourself, Norhan?
Yes, hi. I was just a little concerned there might be a little bit of noise in the background, but thank you Ola. This was a very informative talk, and I was very happy to listen to especially the ways in which Boko Haram was represented in terms of vilification and that construction of national identity as opposed to the terrorist group. I was particularly interested in the analytical framework, especially in just how much detail you laid it out with on your slide. And I was wondering if you can walk us through the choice of that analytical framework, or if you'd considered any other alternatives in the process.
Thank you very much, Nohan. Well, I did consider other frameworks, and I would answer that and then walk you through the actual framework I use. So this was in my first year. I hadn't heard anything about ground theory. The reason that was proposed to me was because he said, the person who proposed it said, the study bestrides linguistics and politics. So I shouldn't just limit myself or box myself into a corner and then just move in with only a linguistic framework. So one of the first frameworks that was actually proposed to me for me to consider was ground theory. Unfortunately, I didn't go that route because, like I said, when I started out, I was keen on seeing how ideology is unraveled in discourse, and ground theory wasn't going to do that for me. And so this then started to limit or streamline the choices I could make. It had, from the title itself, it was already decided that this would be a CDA study. And so I now had to sieve through the different schools in CDA as to which one would be most applicable. Initially, I thought I could keep all of them separate, but long into my PhD, I found that there were certain things I could pick out of one or the other. The example that I would give is the notion of the ideological square, which is Van Dijk's notion and which he applies in CDA, which I then was still able to bring in despite the fact that I was using Fairclough's approach to CDA, which has a much more keen bias towards power relations and social structures. So I was able to use those. So those are things where I saw. So the question would also be, or why didn't I just stick with Van Dijk alone? No, it was more like not cherry picking, but I was picking aspects that would help me tease the data in a manner that would give me the kind of rich analysis that I was looking for. Oh, and then finally, SFG, which nearly cut my head off.
Thanks so much. Thank you.
Thanks, Ola. Do we have any other questions from the floor? No? Okay, so if there are no more questions, I would like to thank Ola very much for spending your morning with us and for sharing your research with us. Thank you everybody for joining us this evening. I hope you have a lovely evening and a lovely weekend, and we hope to see you again for the next research talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Melissa.
Thank you.